Hi, my name is Monique Perez, and today I will be talking about Chapter 11's eating disorders. And there are 7 eating disorders talked about in here, but there are 3 main ones that I will be talking about out of the 7, just personally from my own experience and things that I've already known that have happened and what I know about them. I do have notes that I will be reading off of, but I will also be talking about my experience. I do have a PowerPoint that is included with this video presentation, and I hope that is okay. But now I'll begin. So Chapter 11 starts off talking about how when learning about eating disorders, but there are studies that question where eating disorders come from, how are they developed, and what necessarily happens to people when they have these eating disorders. And in the beginning, we see that a lot of eating disorders can actually be contributed to dysfunctional families, like families with a lot of neglect, families with a lot of dysfunction in the sense of a really controlling parent, or or with a lot of negativity in the family along the lines of one's physical appearance. And I will be talking more about that as I continue on what each disorder I talk about. So main points of eating disorders are, how they develop, and like I mentioned, dysfunctions in families, and also whether it's neglect or whether it's a controlling parent or whether there's a lot of emotional instability. They also show in the chapter, and they talk about the fact that a lot of it could also be related to genes and genetics, and the way that a mother was under stress during her pregnancy. And in my history of these eating disorders with people that I personally know and also myself, I can tell you that they are pretty spot on. My sister-in-law has body dysmorphic disorder, and she also has anorexia. She has been on and off with her journey as far as healing and her recovery. And from what I've known, as far as her own journey with it, she does a lot of the extreme categorizations of anorexia, which are like extreme dietary restrictions, or she just cannot look at herself. She thinks she needs, to lose this weight and that weight. And also her perception of herself is very different than what a lot of us see. And she will go through the motions of binging and purging all the time. Another thing I will say is that her mom did have a very rough marriage, and she was the second daughter. My sister-in-law was the second daughter and child of her mom's marriage, and the marriage was incredibly dysfunctional. So the mom never really had a stable area where she was less stressed. She was the mom of one at the time. Her husband didn't work, and they also dealt and did drugs as well. So a lot of what is said in the book really correlates with what my sister-in-law has gone through. And I know that there are 2 different types of anorexia, which is one type my sister-in-law has, which is the binging and the purging. But also she has the type where she is very restrictive on what she eats. And the other one that I want to talk about is called bulimia. And this one is the one that I actually personally have history with, alongside the binge eating, other eating disorder. So with bulimia and binge eating, I feel they're very like coexisting, but not so much as anorexia and binge eating. Anorexia and bulimia. Anorexia and bulimia are very, very mirrored in a sense, but they do have different things that they are not mirrored about. So with bulimia, it's more of like the way it was described in the book was of ravenous hunger. And I noticed a lot of that within my sisters. Growing up, we had a very emotionally unstable home. My mom had a lot of trauma she didn't deal with, so she was very controlling. A lot of her own trauma was, generationally given to us because of how she was controlling, and how she was very much a strict parent of, we are going to do what I say when I say. That there was a point growing up where my oldest brother, because I am one of 6, did tell her, Mom, we do not respect you, we fear you. And that was the best way to explain it. So with bulimia for my sisters, they were considered the thin sisters in the family. And they were always praised for being thin, being beautiful, but also were praised for not eating much. So there were times when my sisters would be going through a lot of emotional distress, whether it was breakups with boyfriends or arguments with my mom, where they would stuff their faces. There was a time as well that both of those sisters actually moved out of my mom's house before the age of 18, living with an uncle and an aunt. And that's when their bulimia was really bad. They did a lot of self-harm as well. And so their bulimia and self-harm kind of were living codependently. And the only time that for both of them, the self-harm and the bulimia was better was when they were not necessarily in an unstable environment. So moving back in with my mom a couple years later, my mom was already taken care of emotionally, and she was diagnosed bipolar. And so her being medicated, she became a whole different person. So our coexisting together was a lot better. So they were able to kind of work through their own bulimia and self-harm through therapy, but also through healthier ways of developing a relationship with my mom. Now, the other one that I wanted to talk about was binge eating. Like I said, there are 7 of them. And after I talk about binge eating, I will talk about the other 4. Binge eating is something I personally have a lot of experience with. I was considered the chunkier sister of all 4 of my sisters. I was shamed for eating. I was shamed for eating a certain amount, a certain thing. And this was also with my mother before she was diagnosed. And I didn't realize that I had an eating disorder until about 3 years ago. I thought the type of eating I was doing was normal, but I since found out that wasn't normal and it wasn't healthy. I would go through this cycle that my nutritionist and my therapist would tell me was a cycle of binging like crazy and then restricting like crazy. And it is what made me gain so much weight after a hysterectomy that I had. I am, thank God, very much in recovery after, I want to say it's been about 2 years in recovery. I now go to the gym about 3 to 4 days a week. I work at a gym as well. And my biggest thing that I still struggle with to this day, but I still go to therapy and I talk about it. I do a lot of self-help and do a lot to help, is that when I am emotionally going through something, I do tend to rely more on food. And that is kind of one of the things that happens with these eating disorders. They're triggered by stress, emotional stress. They're triggered by just a way of self-harm and a way of dealing with trauma as well, because when a person feels that they have no control over certain things, they tend to want to control what they can control, which in this aspect would be the food intake, the purging, or the binge eating, like I have done in the past, and currently going through a phase of binge eating that I am really struggling, but working towards as well. The other eating disorders that were on here that I actually had not heard of, 2 of them. One of them, one of the 4 is pica, and that's PICA. And I know that that has to do with wanting to eat things that aren't necessarily things you're supposed to eat. And I think that that is incredible for me in the sense to know more about, because I have a child with autism, and it is actually known that children with autism usually have this type of eating disorder. The other one is rheumatation disorder, which I never heard about, but I did deal with something similar at the age of 18. And this is where you regurgitate your food to where the food is still kind of whole and you kind of chew on it and everything. I didn't do that, but I had something similar. And I know it is sounds really gross, and it is, but a lot of people do this, and they do that so that way they don't have to be eating so much, and they can say, oh, well, you know, my stomach, and I'm not feeling this way. And it is considered a psychological condition, but also it is a physical issue, because some people do have stomach issues like I did at 18 that deal with things like this. The other one is the avoidant restriction food intake disorder, which could be a type of person that seems incredibly picky, but this is more of a psychological thing, in the sense that there is trauma based off of some food that they've eaten that now they have not been able to keep weight on, that they have to have a G-tube installed or something like that. And this is usually, you know, found in children, but it does sometimes happen to adults who started with anorexia, and the safe foods are now no longer safe. The other one is orthorexia nervosa, which for me, I thought was so crazy. I've never seen anything like this. I mean, it makes sense psychologically when you think about it, that yes, if you go from one extreme to another, it can develop as the other extreme. And this extreme is actually about when you eat an overly amount of healthy food, that you refuse to do anything in the sense of fatty foods, high calorie intake foods, you know, things that are okay to have in moderation, you would absolutely refuse. And I am shocked that this is a thing, but with that being said, I have seen this in other people as well that I've come across in my life. I never knew that it was a thing, but like I said, with it being a spectrum of different eating disorders and different ways that eating disorders work, I understand and comprehend how these eating disorders can go from one extreme of absolutely no eating or restricting or binging and purging to the absolute other end of the spectrum, where it is just absolutely only healthy things I will eat, and I will only eat those. I will not do anything else. And I think that in a psychological perspective, it is pretty it's pretty fascinating to see the way our brains as humans work in that aspect. So those are the eating disorders I talked about. In my slideshow, I do mention a lot of physical attributions that categorize these eating disorders, but also the things that the eating disorders will also cause us to have issues with. And I mean, they all three range, well, necessarily all of them, we will have nutrition deficiencies. It will affect our gastrointestinal, skeletal, muscular, and, oh gosh, I can't remember what it's called, endocrine, I can't say it, systems, but also things like mobility and things of that nature. And I think it's just something so intense that a lot of us don't realize that anorexia is one of the main eating disorders that has a really high mortality rate. So that is my chapter 11, enrichment. And I'm so sorry that my video did go double the time. I really hope that this was informative to you, and I hope that this is what you were looking for. I hope you have a great day. Thank you so much for watching.